Preparing for live stream, not bad. A little bit of latency. Okay. All right, I think live stream, not bad. A little bit of latency. Let's not do that. Okay. All right, back to Zoom so I can see you all. Got it. All right, I think we're good to go. So we'll go ahead and record. I even know that the YouTube DVR works fine. Just in case we need to edit the video at all, which I don't perceive that we're going to need to do, and I don't really mind it being all that raw. We'll go ahead and we'll jump into this. But yeah, I wanted to announce that Brighton is home. And they're learning. Josh and Kelly are learning how to make this work, and I'm excited for them. And so thank you for your prayers. I am absolutely stoked that we did not lose that baby and that she is on the road or path to some semblance of a life. And of course, we are still seeking miracles. We are still trying to get her to breathe on her own. Let's get that breathing ventilator thing out of her life, and we'll just continue working. We'll work in phases to try to get this going. So at any rate, we'll go ahead and get started. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So we are well on our way into the Passover season. Tonight at sundown, according to the calendar that this ministry uses, we will be beginning to watch the lamb to see whether it is without blemish. And for the next 5 days, we will examine the lamb to identify whether or not it is a lamb that is able to be used in the Passover sacrifice. At any rate, in that process, we have a very interesting coincidence, and that is that this is the parasha of the ordination of Aaron. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that from the perspective of the idea that authority begets authority. Now, I think that we have, as a congregation, looked at this subject sufficiently enough to understand some pretty specific dynamics. Okay, so let's start with the first one. The first dynamic that we have going on is the idea that honor qualifies and dishonor disqualifies, and that is a supernatural mechanism. As you walk in dishonor of an authority who has been qualified, you disqualify yourself. In fact, the ultimate of this, obviously, is the icons or symbols that are used to direct a identification of the devil in the king of Tyre and the king of Sidon. And there's an indication both in Ezekiel and in Isaiah that this person tried to exalt itself above the throne of God. And in that way, we see a dishonor disqualifying, and then there's a whole bunch of prophecy behind what would happen. Well, one of the significant things that is present in that understanding is basically an idea that what we have in our hearts as honor and dishonor then equates to whether or not the supernatural, or perhaps we could go with the entire universe if we go from dominion. So if you think in terms of, for example, right now I'm house sitting and I have 2 dogs that I am responsible for. And as I have interacted with those dogs, they've learned to anticipate what I want at certain times. Now, intriguingly enough, that is different from the idea of me training them. And what I mean by that is they begin to see what I like and dislike, and they obey that. Well, in the same way, the universe itself as a whole, the cosmos, take the Hubble telescope and point it in some direction, go all the way out there and point it in some direction again, or maybe this new telescope, doesn't matter. You get my point. However far out we get, this cosmos is part of that dominion. All things are under our feet and all things are obedient to our command, even when it appears that they're not. I know that there are animals who are disobedient. There are insects who are disobedient to dominion, but that also has to do with honor qualifying and disqualifying. But here's my point. When a person is qualified supernaturally, that person then has qualification of dominion present in their life, right? Okay. So the reason why this is important is because that's one element of authority. The second element of authority is, and it looks like we are a little bit frozen, but I'm going to assume we're going to keep going. The second element of authority is the premise of basically the idea that when we have someone who we are subordinate to, we're actually the ones that cause that person to be elevated into the position that they're elevated into. Pause this for a minute. See if I can get it to catch up.
You are good on this end.
Okay. I figured I was. It's just frozen up on my computer. I don't have a problem with that. I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good with the idea that we're just going to keep going here. So at any rate, the premise is that on the one side, we have this downward trickling effect of positive reinforcement of authority. Authority begets authority, okay? On the other side, we have the concept of a subordinate raising authority into position, okay? And in that process, there is an idea that as that person raises that authority into position, the Father then lifts us up into a position of authority. Okay. So one is dynamic upon the other. Authority down trickles as honor qualifies.
Now you're froze.
has determined, hello? What's up?
You were froze for about a minute.
Okay. Okay, looks like we're still good though. Okay, so let's recap. So you have authority trickling down, right, through qualification. The principle is that honor qualifies, dishonor disqualifies. And so as authority travels down this waterfall-like effect, as it finds somewhere that there's no qualification, that stops there. Because whoever's here, everything underneath it now is in a state of disqualification. Now watch how this works. So a subordinate comes along and raises authority into a position of authority, right? This is the idea of the soldiers being loyal to the general. Otherwise, what's the use of the general's stars, right? It's that principle that they're not going to honor the authority and raise it up into a position of authority. So it doesn't matter that the authority has that designation. This is rebellion, right? Okay, so the whole idea is authority trickles downward and authority begets authority. So this authority gives jurisdiction or agency to this authority, gives jurisdiction or agency to this authority until there's a disqualification, and that stops. Okay. Now, here's something interesting. If you have an authority here, an authority here, an authority here, an authority here, and this authority is out of order, and the subordinates underneath it now do not have to obey that authority, but they choose to, and they elevate that authority into its position. The scripture says the earth cannot stand for that. In other words, the entire inheritance of Adam and his sons will not allow someone who's been elevated into a position of authority to stay in that position of authority because they were elevated there without authorization and without honor. So here goes again. Downward trickling. Okay. Qualification. Elevation. And that qualifies for elevation, elevation, elevation. Each subordinate elevates the other person into a state of authority, has qualified themselves, even if that authority is not qualified. Now, I know that gets a little confusing. So the way I want you to think about it is if you have a general who commands a lieutenant to do something, and that lieutenant is disobedient to that general, but that lieutenant commands a private to do something, and that private obeys him, the private has qualified himself, the lieutenant has disqualified himself. According to scripture, the earth can't stand, and they will be unseated as a lieutenant. And the private will be exalted in rank. So now think about that in the supernatural realm. Think about that in spiritual warfare. Think about that in terms of the idea of how that works, that authority trickles downwards to the qualified. It's what gives you authorization to have authority. If you are a man, you are subordinate to God. If you are a woman, you are subordinate to man through man to God. If you are a child, you are subordinate through a woman or a man to God. And if you are a child, you are subordinate to your mother, then your father, then God, right? Until you become older, and then you leave your mother and father and you move out of the house, and you are either under your husband's according as a authority or covering as a woman, or you are under you are under God's authority as a man, and your wife is under you, but now you walk in disobedience and dishonor. She does not have to obey you, but if she does, she gets exalted above you. In other words, if you walk in dishonor with God, your wife has the authority to step above you in power and authority. Now that gets weird, right? Because now all of a sudden we're into the realm that if there's no man of authority present, God will raise up a woman in his stead. And then you got to get into the idea that if you are not a man who's willing to walk in authority, but you are a man who's willing to abuse your authority and your wife exalts you, you will fall. You will fall. You will be dishonored and disqualified from your marriage. But if she doesn't exalt you, and she also walks in disobedience, she has disqualified herself from authority over her children. And so her children will walk in disobedience, or they will exalt her. They're allowed to walk in disobedience because she doesn't have the qualification of authority. But if they do walk in obedience, they elevate her and she will fall. So the dynamic here plays out in many different roles: military, family, work ethic, etc. But there's a couple of things that are very, very, very important here. And that is, authority begets authority. The only way that something can be put in the state of authority is by another authority. And eventually that can be traced back to God. Now, in the olden days, that was traced back to the king and then to God. But we're not thinking in those terms. We're thinking in terms of honor and dishonor and qualification and disqualification and elevation and unauthorized elevation. There's a few reasons why this is important, because there's three kinds of people in your circle of influence. There are teachers. There are people who were appointed in some way, shape, or form to be a teacher. Okay? And in that way, they have walked in qualification and been given authority by another authority over you, and that possibly could have been God. Well, then we take into consideration the process or the function of there are times where you are going to be the teacher. There are times where you are going to give instruction to your children about provision, protection, instruction comes from the tent, and it doesn't just come from the father. The father provides provision, protection, and instruction, and that then trickles down to the mother, down to the children. The children then have authority over the livestock and over the crops. Okay? From an agricultural perspective. I mean, if you're rocking a 57-story apartment and you're on the 57th floor, and your best bet at a crop is a couple of tomatoes on the roof, and your best bet at an animal is, a pigeon, same principle, okay? But the symbolic elements of authority then give the process here of there being a person over another person. Now, it's interesting because this gets into gender inequality, and this gets into master and servant. This gets into teacher and student, child and mother, child and father. But the inequalities operate in this realm of honor and dishonor, which is a mechanism. A mechanism. Remember, it says the earth will not stand for an illegal elevation. Now, the reason why this is important is because you need to be aware that when you do elevate somebody, you submit to somebody who actually is not qualified, they'll fall, and you'll feel like, what did I do that for? But you don't realize that you're the one who caused their falling. Because maybe they'll fall so far as to be broken, as to fall into a state in which then they would now turn their hearts back to the Father. But what's really interesting is that's really not necessarily what this message is about. Intriguingly enough, what we encounter when we're dealing with this premise of honor and dishonor and authority begets authority, I want you to think about on what state of authority Moshe had to have been to ordain Aharon, who was ordained as high priest. I propose to you that he was in a higher state of authority than Aharon. But he definitely was not a priest. In fact, there's an indication that only the sons of Aaron and Aaron himself were allowed to be priests. Aaron was high priest. Then we have his children, his 4 sons. 2 of them get fried in the strange fire, or the strange fire incident, I should say. And then one of those other 2 then becomes high priest with Joshua, I believe. But my point is that there's an authority above the high priest. Now, there's 2 reasons why this is important. Number 1 is because of this verse right here. Let me go ahead and pull it up real quick. It is going to be in Hebrews chapter 5. Verse 2. It says, every high priest is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. He presents their gifts to God and offers sacrifices for their sins. And he is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward people because he himself is subject to the same weaknesses. Now, let me change this over to maybe NASB. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself is also clothed in weakness. Now, we'll go one more here. Let's do Young's literal, see what he says. Able to be gentle to those ignorant and going astray, since himself also is compassed with infirmity. Okay. So there's something very important that I want you to take into consideration here. This parasha, Tzav, Leviticus or Vayikra 6, all the way to 8:36 discusses the various offerings and how they are supposed to be divvied up. Who gets to eat what? In fact, there is instruction that the offerings that are given are offerings that are present in the process of a reconciliation to the Father through table fellowship. We've discussed this. Go watch How to Satiate a God or How to Satisfy a God. But there is a concept that Aaron and his sons get a special portion of the food. The best of that portion. The right shoulder and the breast of the animal. Now, there's a couple reasons why that is important. This has to do with honor and dishonor, but this also has to do with this crazy idea that the priest himself is weak and needs support. Now, before you start to think that this is a pastor appreciation sermon, it's not. It's something very, very, very important that is present even in the commandments concerning the 3 mandatory pilgrimage feasts: Pesach, Pentecost, and Sukkot. But this is a season for this, right? Because we're coming into Passover. We got 5 days. Anybody who was in Israel, who is going to be able to go to Jerusalem and isn't on a journey, has already arrived in Jerusalem by now. And they are getting ready to select a lamb, and they're getting ready to watch it at evening tonight. Okay. Proverbially, right? They're not doing this in Jerusalem right now because there's no temple. But the principle is that the high priest was taken care of by the people. And I'm just going to put something out there. The priesthood itself, by the time of David, is so large that David divides up the priesthood into 12 courses. And in the concept of, in 24 courses. And in the concept of a year, that means that 2 weeks out of the year, the priest was required to work a full week from Sabbath to Sabbath. Okay. They changed out on the Sabbath, and they kept their course for the whole week. And so in principle, what we have is we have the idea that there is a concept of they had to be present at every pilgrimage feast. So that's 3 weeks out of the year they had to work. And then 2 more makes 5 weeks out of the year they had to work. And so I propose to you that the priests only had to work 5 weeks out of the year. They got the best cut, they got the best portion, and they got all of the stuff, right? So you would think in that way that there needs to be some sort of honoring of a priest, right? They're held in a certain regard. They're given all this honor. Subordination elevates them into a position of honor. Higher authority anointed and ordained them. And now they are in a state of doing what they're created to do, what they're supposed to do, the office that was created, the officiation of the priesthood. Okay? Special meats were given and eaten. All kinds of things were gone on. The blood on the lobe of the ear, on the right thumb, and on the right toe. All of these different things were done. And there was anointing on the head of Aharon, which the psalmist in 133 equated to the beauty of unity and the beauty of the water cycle in Israel. Like they were one and the same. All of them were beautiful. And remember that Jacob was given the dew of heaven. So when we're going through all this, there's a temptation to continue to look in the direction and say, oh yeah, we need to elevate that person, and you are not wrong. If there is a teacher in a position of authority over you, you need to walk in honor. And there is a necessity to read between the lines of the priesthood and see there was a lot of time unaccounted for in their life. But the 5 weeks that they worked, they were a minister of the Most High. And that was provided for with the best of what was given. And in that process of being provided for, they didn't have an allotment, obviously, but they didn't have their process the same as the rest of the Israelites. Their inheritance was Yahweh, and somehow that put them in a position of honor that's dangerous to be messing with. Remember, David would not touch the Lord's anointed. And yet there are tongues that rise up against those who are anointed. You say, well, wait a minute. You said this isn't Pastor Appreciation Sermon. It isn't. I'm about to show you. One of the provisions of understanding is it's a given that the tithe goes to the Levite, right? The Levite who only works 5 weeks out of the year. And that there is a provision provided for every sin offering that comes along. They are given meat for food. They didn't work for their food in the sense of how you would think work is. So there's this absolute exaltation of one of authority in the priesthood. And I propose to you that that is a symbol of how you are supposed to treat authority. And that you have a lot of authority issues. But I'm going to show you an authority issue here that you never realize that you have. And you're going to really embrace this and love it. So obviously I can harp all day on the idea that even Paul said, how come Peter and Barnabas get to bring their wives? How come this guy gets provided for and this guy gets provided for, but I'm not, right? He says that in Corinthians. And there's a big discussion about Corinthians 9, right? But he goes through that chapter proving that a minister has a right to his provision. But here's something very, 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 very interesting. There is a physical provision, absolutely. If you are not in a state of caring for the authority figures in your life in such a way as to verify and make sure that they are in a state of not in want, you're out of order. But I want you to understand that there's something that's missing from that discussion. Because when we get into the shoulder of a ram, or we get into a breast of an animal, we are dealing in the height, width, depth, and time element. And I propose to you that the intensification of all power in the universe actually has something very interesting set up, and that is that as much as there is appointed a teacher and a student, there is appointed a contemporary, and although there is still an inequality, there is never equality. Know this. You are either a subordinate or you are an authority. Get over it. And there are different versions of that and different dynamics of that, but you still need to know when you are one or the other. Because if you're an authority and you're derelict of your duties, you'll be unseated. If you are a student and you're derelict of your duties, you will be disciplined. Simple as that, okay? If you are a subordinate and you are out of order, you will be brought into order. That's what it says in Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 13, I believe it is. Or I'm sorry, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Let every soul be subject to governing authority, for there is no authority except from God. And by the end of those verses, it's flat out says, you want to be unafraid of authority, do what is good, and you'll have praise from the same. But be afraid, because they don't bear the sword in vain, right? They don't bear the sword in vain. Okay, so the reason why this is important is because there's always somebody appointed as a contemporary, and that contemporary will come along and be beside an authority figure. This may be a wife, this may be a friend, depending on, gender and those type of things. But here's the part that's interesting. There is always appointed for an authority figure, including a priest, a source of light. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting about light. First is that it is an order bringer. Remember that the word light itself does pertain to the idea of order. And we're dealing with chaos, all we're dealing with. And I hate using that word because it's obviously it's a name of a Greek god. But when we're dealing with the unfettered, unlimited, undefined function of energy, we are dealing with energy that's out of order. But when order comes into a state of light, when energy comes into a state of light, it comes into order. And when it comes into order on behalf of those who would need order. Okay? So this is really, really important. Yes, there are commandments to take care of and make sure that your authority figures are without want. You can't get around those. I will prove them to you verse after verse after verse after verse, and they apply to me just as much. However, it is very, very important to know that there is usually one, maybe two, but not many sources of light that are put in a position of subordination to you that are literally the only thing that's elevating you. I propose to you that the rest of the sheep go with the rest of the sheep, and they really actually don't have an interest in elevating you. So you as a shepherd will have a bunch of sheep who will go with the flow. And if there's a rebellion, there's a rebellion. If there's obedience, there's obedience. But there's the select few in that flock who will offer something that the rest don't. And that is a very special kind of elevation. It's those moments when you're like, oh my God, you have no idea how I needed to hear that today. It's those moments when it's that God timing, right? Where it's like you're just a train wreck. And you know, you've got kids and animals and crops and a spouse and work and politics and jobs and profits and all kinds of stuff going on in your life. And there's that one that goes here. And at that moment, you're like, oh. It's really interesting. I received this message actually on Shabbat of last week, not really knowing about what was going to be in the Parasha because I don't read it before it's time. And there was this moment of a realization that I can't pinpoint a person like that in my life. And so I thought, well, I wonder who else can't. And so I asked everybody on all of my contacts list, on Slack, on TikTok, on regular SMS contacts, who is the person who is the most light in your life? Now, there were about 3 who said, oh, it's Christ. That's not what I asked. There were 3 who said it was me. And the rest said, oh, it's my grandma, or oh, it's my wife. And there was one person who said, I am. Now, I'm going to propose to you that a couple things that come to mind. Number one, Adam was in full fellowship with God in the garden. He had no emotional deficits. He had no drama. He had no mommy and daddy drama. He didn't have any temptations of sin. He didn't have any darkness in his life. He did not have anything by which he would be rebellious to God. And yet the Father identifies in him that he is lonely. And so he appoints a help that will meet him where he's at, or that is a perfect fit, right? To elevate him, to give him what he needs to do the work of God. Now, the reason why this is important is because it demonstrates three things. There's a God involvement, there's a human involvement, and there's a deficit that God obviously could not answer himself. He obviously created that in Adam, or maybe that was a side effect of the creation of Adam, because Adam was made in the image of God, and there's a whole discussion about the feminine attributes of God. But we'll just go into the idea here that there is a provision by God of light in a person's life. And that elevation of light will equate to order of your chaos in such a way that you'll go, oh God, I needed that. I needed that. I needed this moment. I needed to hear those words. There's a couple things that are important about that people aren't ready to handle. And that is that if a person has stepped into a position of elevation like that, they have placed themselves in subordination to that person. Somehow. Whether it be their shield bearer, or whether they be a student, or whether it be their spouse as a helpmate, or whether it be a child in support of their parent, when you drop to the level of lifting somebody up, you have to get under them to lift them. What does that mean? That means that the priest who is clothed with weakness is elevated not only by the ordination from the authority above them, but is elevated by the subordination below them, which requires what? Absolute authentication of the authority that was above them, but also subordination. And that includes provision. However, you providing food, you providing sustenance, you providing housing, you providing transportation, you providing heat and clothing is not that light. It's not that light. A soul may be comforted in that state. You see, it says, I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was cold and you gave me a cloak. I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick and you attended to me. But who is walking in the state of the priesthood is going to walk into a sick person's tent and not heal them? And who is going to walk into a prison house and visit an inmate and not offer change? Not offer a way of being different so you don't end up there again. My point is that there's a difference between take no thought for what you shall eat, what you shall wear, and what you shall drink, and elevation of the light. Remember, light will always bring order to your chaos, and it will always come from a subordinate, because in order to get there, you have to get under and lift. What does that mean? The one who receives the light needs to recognize the position. They need to recognize that even if a person has been in authority over them, at that moment that they humbled themselves and raised you up, they put themselves in authority over you. And so now there's an understanding in this verse. And I think it's important to pay attention to verse 2. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, because he himself is also clothed with weakness. Two things that come from that verse. Number one is the idea that I need to be provided for as a priest. I have no allotment of land by which I can buy or sell or trade in order to accomplish wealth. Okay? And so therefore, that being the case, there is a concept present that I need clothing, food, housing. Remember the cities of refuge, and remember the Levites being provided a place to live because they themselves did not receive an inheritance from Yahweh. And so from that position, then there's provision, protection, and instruction necessarily being provided by the priest to the people. And in return, there is what you will wear, what you will eat, and what you will drink provided by the people back to priests. But when it says he can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, because he himself is also clothed with weakness, I'm going to propose to you that one dynamic of this is that if a person is ignorant and misguided, they are inferior to you. And if they are inferior to you, the reason why you are able to be gentle with them is because of the fact that you have been put in a superior state. So I propose to you, if that there's any function of that present, that you're put into a superior state, then I promise you, your order will, or your chaos will come into order through a subordinate, which requires you to listen to them when they say, hey, I don't think you should do this. Requires you to take a moment to hear what they have to say, give them a voice, because they might be the one that elevates you. And if you're closed off to that, But also there's one more thing. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, right? Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will raise you up to a position of honor. You humble yourself to raise somebody into a position. You elevate a person by bringing order to their chaos, which could be as simple as a word and as great as a service. I mean, if there wasn't a greater confirmation for this house that I'm sitting has 17 acres on it. And in the 17 acres, the Juniata Reservoir empties into his property. And he works a full-time job. His wife works a full-time job. And so there's not a lot of ability to care for this property. And it's interesting how all this works, because he says, man, I keep meaning to clean out the ditch. I keep meaning to clean out the ditch. So I'm out there exercising the dogs before I'm going to put them in the kennel so I can do my Shabbat service. And this tractor pulls onto the property. I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm the ditch maintenance guy. And I was like, oh, okay. So I call my friend Rob and I was like, hey, there's a tractor on your property and he's digging. And he's like, what? And so he wants to talk to him. And so one thing leads to another. And basically the sentiment that was in my friend's mind was that he was going to have to pay for this. And so he was trying to get it done on his own because he knew that they might be coming, but he knew he would get charged. Well, evidently, when he bought the back half of the property, the other 12 acres added to the 5, he gained such a large amount of water shares that his ditch is actually priority over everything else. So when I say that your chaos will be brought into order by somebody inferior to you, however much that man asserted as he came on the property and approached the easement with his tractor and began digging in the ditch, removing the brush and clearing out my friend's ditch for free because he's the superior water shares in this area, a subordinate brought his chaos into order. He doesn't have time to clear out the ditch. So now his gate is clean. His irrigation gate is clean. His ditch all the way down is clean. All the brush that was going to interfere with the water is moved out of the way. This was the greatest confirmation for my message today. And when I realized what was being said, the guy was like, oh yeah, he owns 8 shares. It didn't register. I was like, so? I didn't realize that's a lot of water. That's a lot of water. So at any rate, my point behind this is his chaos was brought into order by a subordinate. What's interesting is that subordinate is working on his behalf to bring his chaos into order, but he had to allow it. When I first texted him, say, hey, there's a tractor on your property, he wanted to come home and get the shotgun, right? And he was like, no, don't let him do that. They're going to charge me money. And I was like, all right, why don't you talk to him? And by the end of the conversation, they're both talking about the Lord, right? And literally the guy's like, oh yeah, the Lord provides. The guy in the tractor says that. And I was like, okay, there's your signature. There's your signature. You're doing what you promised, that you would bring our chaos into order. But now watch this. Just as much as the priest realizes that his weakness gives him the ability to get up under the ignorant and misguided, that he can have patience or deal gently with the ignorant and misguided. Let's talk a minute about the ignorant and misguided. Those who go with what's right in their own eyes over the order and the instruction that the Father has given. Do not worship me the way that the nations worship their God. I will tell you how to worship me, and part of it are these 3 mandatory pilgrimage feasts, in which you will not sacrifice the Passover lamb in your cities, but you will consume it in the place where I put my name. And you will not show up empty-handed. You will bring a gift for me. What are you going to give God? You're just going to go lay whatever gift that is at some statue? No. You're not supposed to worship. You're not supposed to worship the way that the nations do. We don't go set food out to rot because maybe that God might want to eat it. Unto the least of these, you give it. And so the principle is you're not going to worship me that way. You're going to worship me this way. And here's my instruction concerning it. Those are the ones who are doing what's right in their own eyes, worshiping him how they want. They're going to appropriate a pagan custom and say, here you go, Lord. Here. We're gonna do an Easter egg hunt on your behalf, because somehow that equates to the resurrection. Anyways, so The point being is that the ignorant are those who are doing what's right in their own eyes and not listening to the Torah that's been written on their heart, Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. They are not circumcised at heart, Romans chapter 2, verses 18 through 21. And they are being what? Serving the creation more than the creator, suppressing the truth, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 21. And they are refusing to learn. An ignorant person is somebody who has chose not to learn the truth. So now let's talk about the misguided. The misguided are their sheep. The misguided are those ones who have learned from the errant ones the ways of the errant ones. And it says the high priest can be gentle with them. And his rebuke, in his teaching and instruction, in his patience and gentleness, in his judgment as Supreme Court justice, etc., etc. Because he himself needs to be elevated. He himself is weak. He himself cannot provide for himself. That's why he gets the right shoulder. That's why he gets the breast. He himself cannot do it. He can't. And so as a result of that, then there would need to be a subordinate. Out of all the sheep, there would need to be the single one who has the most light in his life. And I propose to you that the concept here is when you see your chaos come into order and it's not what you expected. It's not what you planned. It's not the source by which it should come. And it is evidently a God operation. Remember, God had to be involved in the Eve-Adam thing. Adam was in full fellowship with God. That's a given. Adam did what God told him to do. He named the animals, proverbially. And I say proverbially because obviously we've studied the Hebrew. There's different stuff going on there. But the premise, the short version of this is Adam was not in a state of disobedience, and he was not in a state of rebellion towards God. He wasn't rejecting God because he was lonely. That's not present. And it can't be present. So then all of a sudden, a higher authority appoints Adam as authority over a helpmate. Now, I know that's difficult for some. I'm kind of witnessing that right now play out where a woman is experiencing the frustration of the gender inequality that's in Torah. Torah does not apologize for the gender inequality. And God is either just or he isn't. So he creates Eve. Eve becomes the answer to the deficit. Everything's fine. Now he's in full fellowship with God and he's complete. So in the same way, now all of a sudden the Father brings a subordinate into your life, and that person bears so much light that your chaos starts to come into order. Recognize it. Remember, it has to be out of character. It has to be out of expectation. It can't be in the sense or in the state in which you could say that it was something where you did it. It can't be in a state or a function of normal operation. It will be anomalous. I submit to you that if an authority brings your order, your chaos into order, you're being disciplined. But you're also not being elevated. You will experience elevation and go, that was a good day. That was amazing. I just had the most amazing experience. What you don't realize is that it's all part of that process of God's provision, protection, and instruction. And I propose to you that your chaos doesn't necessarily have to be this devastating, damaging, trauma-causing drama. It can be as simple as someone just giving you a kind word, and you're like, you just stop and you're like, oh, that day just went well. But here's something interesting. As the light diminishes and the elevation comes and goes, that thought, that experience fades away. But I want you to think a minute about what it means to be a covering over someone. I want you to think about the concept that an authority, whether they be a teacher, and obviously we get into the allegorical elements of it, but a teacher still gives you provision, protection, and instruction. A teacher is protecting you from your ignorance, providing you with something new, and instructing you on how to carry those things out, right? So then we get into the idea that if a person has elevated you, therefore they've put themselves under you, then I think you would agree with me, something is supposed to happen with you and them, right? What's my point? My point is as somebody comes along and elevates you, they have gotten under you, which means provision and protection and instruction is supposed to come from you now. And I propose to you, as that honor has qualified them, you now bestow authority upon them. You now give them provision, protection, and instruction. But the premise is that you need to recognize the light when it comes. Listen, there are people who are rote obedient to their perception, perhaps their renegotiation of Torah. There are people who are very, 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 very obedient, just as a mechanical process to the process of Torah. They are not light givers. They don't come with the idea of making sure that the high priest is okay and giving him more than just food, and giving him more than just shelter, and giving him more than just the basic necessities of life. Although it is supposed to be an abundant amount, and I kid you not, there is money involved too. The tithe goes to the Levite, and the Levite was to give it to the priest. There's money. And so in that premise, then we have meat, bread, money, land, all provided to that person, right? But what's interesting is the priest is offering a service to the people. And so none of that plays that dynamic, because now the priest has wife drama, or the priest has child drama, or the priest has whatever drama, and somebody comes along and they speak order from chaos, or they give energy and they demonstrate, and I will say acts of service is part of this, but it's very different from the duty of the people to the one in authority. Duty is different, because there's a possibility that the person who is in authority maybe hasn't been able to get the laundry done. And so now you come and help them do their laundry. And it's just one little thing out of their week that they don't have to do. And it opens up a whole new avenue of energy and motivation and positive process. So obviously, on the one hand, we have the function that the high priest is demonstrated to be weak, and he needs to be elevated. And one of the areas he needs to be elevated in has nothing to do with material process. And so along comes a person who gets up under them and gives them light, order. The chaos is brought into order. It is the responsibility of that one to recognize the light. Because once that light has come and chaos has been brought into order, the subordination demonstrates that that person is under. And there's a tendency for us who are over to overlook that elevation. Look at what happened with Mordecai, right? Mordecai has of all things, Mordecai has no reason to be loyal to Xerxes. Xerxes was one foul cat, politically and narcissistically. He was not pleasant, okay? But Mordecai finds out that there's a plot to kill him, to kill Xerxes. And Mordecai literally goes against the principle. I mean, talk about having your enemy handed into your hand. This is like David in Saul in the cave. I will not touch the Lord's anointed. And so Mordecai delivers Xerxes from death. Okay? Whether it was because he was a Jew, whether it was because Xerxes was bogged down in trying to invade Greece, or whatever it was, Mordecai was never recognized for his task. He was overlooked. Mordecai brought Xerxes' chaos into order through a word. And Xerxes just kept operating. It's very easy, people, to miss it. You need to recognize when that light comes and that chaos loosens up, and you have a good moment, and you just kind of keep going through your day. You don't realize the level of lowering that had to occur in order for someone to raise you up. The amount of humility, the amount of willingness, obedience, readiness, availableness that they had to give to the Father to know exactly when you would need it. We are not dealing with a person who does things that's right in their own eyes. We're not dealing with a person who's disobedient to God. We're not dealing with a person who hasn't themselves suffered enough to have been humbled enough to know exact timing of God. What I mean by that is that we're not dealing with somebody who's just going through the motions. A person who elevates another person has suffered enough to realize that elevation is necessary, as able to be humbled enough to know exactly how to be obedient and listen to God, for God to be able to say, I need you to go do that with that person right now, and to be open to that process. And yet we will continue in our operation as if nothing happened, because that little elevation actually opened up our ability to do more. Remember, this thing is about upward, right? And outward. And so we have upward and outward. Let me show you this. Expansion outward will always be an enlarging of the borders outwardly, horizontally, okay? That outward movement is supposed to be elevating as it goes. So it's not this, it's this, okay? Now, what's important is that elevation is a vertical process. It's not expansion. Elevation is raising somebody's energy, raising their frequency, raising their positive energy in such a way that they're able to do more with this here. Okay? And so the process is that there's an upward and outward spiraling as a result of elevation and expansion occurring at the same time that can only come through the support of a subordinate. That's the simple version of this. And that there is a concept of needing to get up under in order to elevate. But an understanding is as chaos comes into order, more space is created for expansion. That can be dangerous because you can overlook the elevation as a result of an opening up of the opportunity for expansion. It's literally the idea of running over the guy, right, that is trying to help you expand in the first place. What does that mean? Number one, the high priest, let's recap this in a way, okay? The high priest can be gentle with those who are misguided and ignorant because they themselves are weak. That realization of weakness means they themselves need provision, protection, and instruction provided by the people, but that's duty. The above and beyond is appointed to bring chaos into order. That needs to be recognized. And when I say recognized, I don't mean credit. You need to be able to say, oh, that's an anomaly. I better pay attention to that. That is definitely light. You need to say, okay, I'm good here. That's light. But it goes a step further because once a person has put themselves in a position of honoring you, they qualify themselves, which means you need to do some things. Let's talk about what those things are. First of all, you need to exalt their qualification. You need to give them recognition of their qualification by taking your authority and trickling authority down to them, which would be delegation. Okay, that's one. Number two, and when I say delegation, what I mean is you raise them into a position of honor that, like what happened with Mordecai, right? Where Xerxes calls Haman in and says, hey, if I wanted to honor somebody, what do? Haman gives him all these instructions, and so he does it to Mordecai and tells Haman to carry out the process. Point being is you honor someone who has brought your chaos into order. You speak words of honor. You give honor and you ordain them as somebody honorable. It doesn't have to be a big deal. You could just flat out say, God's going to give you more responsibilities. And I recognize your honor. It doesn't have to be some big ordination ceremony. Second, you need to recognize that a person who has stepped into the role of bringing your chaos into order is in a state of humility. A person cannot bring a person's chaos into order if they are out of order themselves. So you need to understand that they're a special person. Now that doesn't mean that their whole entire life is together. There's no such thing. There is chaos present in everything. I might be a really good teacher, or I might be somebody who's able to expand upon the Word of God. I may be able to hear him and be obedient enough to let him speak through me. But it doesn't mean that I got all my stuff together. Far from it. But as order starts to come, and as this person brings your chaos into order, there's going to be a temptation to jump on that and start running with it, and you don't realize that that person needs to be recognized. But I'm going to take it a step further. You need to nurture the light in that person. I don't know if you know. You may. I don't know if you experienced the version of human that has light in them. To understand that it doesn't come freely. And it doesn't come easily. And it doesn't offer you, as a person who's bringing the light to a person who's bringing their chaos into order, it doesn't, it's not, it's a narrow road. You need to identify, give authority to, and nurture the light. You need to make that person who brought your chaos into order for that moment a very high priority for nurturing. For provision, protection, and instruction, yes, but to make sure that that person is okay. To make sure that they understand what they did for you. You need to give that. That's why I asked all of you, who is the greatest light in your life? Who is the one? Because I'll bet you didn't realize that for them to be the light, they had to be subordinate to you. Because if chaos is coming into order from an authority, it's discipline. It's discipline. And there's no elevation. Listen, you don't get a spanking and then go get to sit on the throne. You get a spanking, so you get humble so that you will be raised into a position of honor. But you don't get to just go from one to the other. But when someone elevates you to the throne, you need to recognize that person, just like Mordecai had to be recognized. Now, the relevance is in the idea that we often are elevated by strangers. But what you don't realize is that if you were already in a position of authority and you're running on empty and someone comes along and fills you, it was never about them filling you. It's about what you're about to do to their life. And if you miss that, it's because you've taken your eyes off of what the position of authority has meant in the beginning of this thing. So how do we recognize it? Do we recognize it by the people who bring an extra case of canned vegetables to the house because you yourself are in a state of authority and they understand that you may need something like that? No. Is it because you give quarter to somebody who's in, like Elijah with the woman? No. It's when there's elevation and your chaos is brought into order by another person's process. It will be anomalous. It will not be the duty of the people. It will be something more. And if you miss it, you'll walk right over them. And two things are going to happen. Number one, it's very possible that they will never again give light, and probably never to you again. But also, you missed that they're a special sheep, that they're a special subordinate. And there's something special that you need to do with them. There's something special that you need to give them. All of us started like this. Before I became a ministerial authority, I elevated people. And I elevated people without condition. In fact, I elevated people being ignorant of who they would become in my life. But now that I'm in a position of authority, I have a congregation, I have responsibilities. Someone comes along and elevates me. I don't have time to turn around and recognize them. I propose to you that there's no greater need of creating a time slot in your world than for the one who brought your chaos into order. And I propose to you that you probably didn't even know that your chaos was out of order until they brought it into order. Because, man, we run around with our heads cut off once we step into this world of repair, of tikkun olam, where all of a sudden it's not about you anymore. You don't go to a Bible study to learn. You go to a Bible study to teach because you're authority. You are more exalted than anybody when you walk into that room. You don't go to a party to have some R&R. There's somebody there who you're supposed to minister to. That's just how it is when you become the change that this world needs. It stops being about you. So when it is about you, take the time to recognize it. Nurture the light. That one. Remember, every one of you that I talked to, I said, tell me who it is. Because they say, oh, it's this person, this person, this person. I pick one. Because I promise you, there's only one, maybe two, but I guarantee you there's only one that holds a torch above all the rest. And you just need to take the time to recognize who it is. They will have the most light. They will demonstrate the most positive energy. And it doesn't mean their stuff is together. They could be a mess. But for that split second and moment, they elevated you. I don't know how many times before I stepped into ministerial authority did I encounter the concept or the idea of a person needing that moment. And I would say, let me see this chaos. Bring it into order. And so as a result of that, obviously there's a moment in time when you're like, oh, I really needed that, right? They would tell me, there's no way you could have known. How did you know? It's important to realize that we have a tendency to look way out on the horizon when there's something present right in front of us and we can't see it because we're out there. Sometimes you have to realize that if some sort of relief comes, I would look around. I would take a minute and say, okay, wait a minute. Something just happened. Like something just got better and I don't know how. I need to figure out what it was, who did it, how, why, right? I think that's key. So let's recap. Authority begets authority. Authority ordains authority, okay? Subordinates elevate authority into a position whether they're qualified or not. If you are disqualified as a result of not honoring, remember, honor qualifies, dishonor disqualifies. Honor qualifies, this person is now qualified. Dishonor disqualifies. So now, as the authority looks at this person, there's no ordination to be had. There's no granting of authority to be given. If a subordinate chooses to elevate an authority, even if that authority is disqualified, that authority will fall. If a subordinate chooses not to be obedient to that authority, there's no consequence because that authority was disqualified. If that a subordinate chooses to be obedient and elevates that authority, they will be exalted. How many times do we see in scripture where somebody is in a lower position, but they honor the authority and then they're elevated to a higher position? I propose to you that this is a spiritual dynamic that you need to pay attention to. Now, there are duties of exaltation. There are duties of elevation, right? There are duties of caring for and taking care and making sure that if there's an authority in your life, that you have demonstrated that you yourself are qualified through the duties, the right shoulder of the lamb, etc. But then there's the anomalies that come along, and instead of it being some sort of material care, there is a spiritual energy, and your chaos comes into order. It is your responsibility to make sure that that person has authority delegated to them, but also that you would nurture that light. You would take them as a special disciple and nurture that light, because they're the change that this world needs. The people who are doing the duty, I guarantee you, if all of them get together and decide you no longer are qualified, they will gladly kick you to the curb. But when that special one comes along and gives you that moment, nurture it. Because there's two things that are going to happen. Number one is their heart will always be towards your order. And they will elevate you. But also, if you don't nurture it and you miss it, they may get discouraged and never try to do it again. And they're definitely probably not going to do it again with you. There's a consequence for not recognizing it. There's a consequence for not rewarding somebody for doing good. So how do we nurture it? You'll know. You will immediately, as you're drawn into the person, you'll know what they need in that moment. And you will have already been enabled to give them what they need. I know this stuff sounds crazy. Just keep in mind the idea that if your chaos comes into order from somebody over you, that's discipline. And there is no elevation there. But if your chaos comes into the light, your chaos comes into order, and it's somebody under you, then you've been elevated. Prepare yourself, because if you have walked in dishonor, I would definitely get into a state of repentance. But also, if you are in a state of honor, prepare yourself, because that exaltation is you're going to level up. You're going to level up. Okay? So it's an interesting dynamic, right? The proof that the high priest needs is in the idea that he's in weakness. That gives him the ability to be patient with the idiots, right? To be gentle with those people who just don't have a clue. But that also means that somebody's going to come along and elevate him. And it's not going to be the sheeple. It's not going to be the status quo. It's going to be somebody else, something different. And you recognize that, and you need to nurture it. Okay? Shabbat Shalom. So I think one of the things that I'm going to do is I need to prepare some food. I'm thinking that might take about 15 minutes. So anybody who's here right now, if you have to leave, if you want to leave or have to leave, I'll wish you Shabbat Shalom. But if you're going to stay, give me some time, and I will get some food figured out, and then we will midrash. I think at this point, let me check the YouTube channel and see if anybody's even listening. And we will make a decision on that, whether we're going to leave YouTube running or not. Okay, looks like not. All right. So at any rate, we'll go ahead and end the YouTube live.